Sure, why not? Okay, now I'm going to pause. Pause. Okie dokie. Well, welcome everyone. I'm very pleased to see so many of you here today. I can see that attendance is growing, so we'll expect people to continue to add on, and that's fine. We're happy to welcome you to the campus at UC Davis and from UC Davis and wherever you happen to be tuning in from. Before we get going, permit me to share some instructions about today's format for the event. We will and are recording today's lecture and we will be posting it on the UC Davis Art History website and social media. So I invite everybody to please make sure that you mute yourselves now and also silence your phones for later. And if you leave your video on, we will take that as your consent to be recorded. Marty has agreed to take questions after his talk. At that time, please raise your hand icon or write your questions into the chat box, and I'll do my best to monitor the questions. When it's your turn to speak, then and only then, please unmute yourself, okay? I think that's easy, and everybody's familiar with those rules now. So then, now let me introduce our guest speaker. Today, we welcome Professor Marty Powers to join us here at the Art History program at the University of California, Davis. Marty is zooming in from Beijing, where he is professor in the School of Arts at Peking University and professor emeritus in History of Art at the University of Michigan. While at Michigan, Marty held the endowed chair of the Sally Michelson Davidson Professor of Chinese Arts and Cultures and, no less, served as my dissertation advisor, and for that I will be forever grateful. Marty has received numerous awards, including from the Center for Advanced Study in the Visual Arts in Washington, D.C., and the Princeton Institute for Advanced Studies. He has published 3 books on visual culture and social justice in China and elsewhere, in addition to several edited volumes. His first 2 books, Art and Political Expression in Early China, which is fabulous, and Pattern and Person, Ornament, Society, and Self in Classical China, also fabulous. Each won, in separate years, the prestigious Levinson Prize for Best Book in Pre-20th Century China, or Chinese Studies, rather, from the Association for Asian Studies, which, as many of you know, is the flagship U.S. organization for all scholars working on Asia. In 2019, Routledge published his China and England, The Pre-Industrial Struggle for Justice in Word and Image, and, together with Dr. Catherine Xiang, he co-edited Looking at Asian Art and The Blackwell Companion to Chinese Art. More recently, he has co-edited a volume with Shuchen Xiang entitled How China Shaped the Enlightenment, A Transcultural History of Modern Thought, which has just been published by Routledge and which has also just been ordered for UC Davis's library. It will be on our bookshelves soon. So without further ado, please welcome Marty Powers, who will speak on the visual logic informing informal gardens in China and Europe. Marty, the Zoom room is yours.
Great. Thanks so much, Kathy, for that introduction. It's a pleasure to be able to speak with the students and faculty at Davis, as well as the larger audience that you put together. Sorry, I can't be there myself. The cab fare was prohibitive. Just wouldn't. I couldn't afford that, nor could you. So yeah, I did speak at Davis years ago, and I still have fond memories of that. That was before almost everyone in the audience was born, I think. But in any case, I'm glad to be back. Now, this is I'm focusing here actually on a visual analysis, a different kind of visual analysis I'm working on. Obviously, that situates itself within a much larger develop within larger developments in social and intellectual history. I won't be spending as much time on that, partly because I've written a book, and also the new volume, which has essays by very eminent German and English and Chinese scholars, deals with some of those issues. But I'm happy to couldn't squeeze it all in, but I'm happy to talk a bit about that in the question and answer period. So actually observation, you could call it hypothesis. Historians can study the changing history of social relations in history as a matter of intergroup relations. That's almost too obvious in a way, right? Um, but when an artist has to portray in pictures members of different ethnic groups, religious groups, status groups in one scene, the rules of decorum generally dictate that he or she reveal the normative relationships between them for the target community. We'll maybe talk about the image on the right later, but on the left, you can see very clearly St. Thomas is above, surrounded by angels. And below we see Muhammad and other heretics crouching down. I mean, this would be a normative relationship within a Catholic Church, in roughly in the early Renaissance. Some artists have to portray in pictures different ethnic groups, and again, this can be done as on the right, where there's a very clear top-down relationship, or as in this detail of an Edward Hicks painting, where he has pretty much tried to eliminate any obvious hierarchy between the indigenous peoples and the Quakers, and rather emphasize their communication and coordination. So this all can be done visually, and we can examine these things with that in mind. Same thing here, different religious groups. Again, St. Thomas crushing Muhammad and other heretics, and a stone painting of the three different moral traditions, Buddhism, Taoism, Confucianism, in a neutral environment, a natural environment, which again helps the artist to downplay any obvious hierarchy. This is true with Hicks also. He chose to put it in a natural environment. Sometimes you have different status groups, not necessarily hereditary status groups, but different figures within a picture might occupy different status positions. These are not always simply readable as top down. So on the left, that 7-year-old child is actually teaching Confucius, and Confucius leans forward to accept the teaching. The whole point of this particular anecdote being that the force of an argument comes from the logic and facts informing it, and not from the status of the person who says it. On the right, also, the tall upper middle class family on the right. This is a German illustration, mid-19th century. This is a sort of a Dickens-like story. So it's actually the little boy who's the hero. He's trying to get money to buy medicine for his mom. The haughty looks on the face of the family perhaps betray the reversal of the expected hierarchy. Here too on the left, you have a 10th century painting which actually portrays a Han Dynasty recluse rather accurately. The furniture, the lacquer trays, everything is the artist did his research, including the relationship between man and wife here, because this is the way it would have been done in the late Han or in China's medieval period. When you get to, and the hierarchy is very clear, up, down. She raises the tray up to her forehead. From Song times onward, on the right, we're looking at a Ming painting, but you'll find this in Song painting also. The relations between men and women literati are again very complex, partly because the third dimension is added, and that's because in fact they really were complex. This happens in Europe also, late 18th century. William Cowper here, the poet on the right. He's the main figure here, and he happens to be an aristocrat, but he's off to the side, even though he's in front. Whereas Mrs. Smith, who's also an author, is in the center, but she's also further back. And likewise, in this Song painting you see on the left, the woman literatus, again, is close to the center of this particular scene, but she's further back and so on. So the artists in both cases have given us a much more complex understanding of the relationships between these people. So from this, we could see potentially that human rights issues can be studied as a matter of intergroup relations or the way they are imagined. The study of images can contribute then to the historical study of human rights. Let me give you a few more examples. What about interstate relations? And we have a couple of examples here. It's interesting on the right. This, of course, is a so-called tribute. It's a detail from a tribute painting. One of the earlier ones shows Tang Emperor Taizong and some emissaries from abroad. John King Fairbank always never got tired of saying that the whole tribute system was extremely hierarchical. It's interesting that all of the paintings throughout history that portray this event are horizontal. And in this case, you can see that Taizong, yeah, he's the host, so he's more important, but he is looking at the emissaries. He's communicating with them. It didn't have to be done that way. Just as another example, I chose a Roman scene from Trajan's column. You see the Roman general is elevated and is very relaxed and is not particularly paying close attention. There's really no communication here. The Dacians are pleading for their lives, which they're not going to get. So these are not accidental. Uh, and as I've always said in my lectures, these are not reflective of any kind of essentialized Volksgeist, okay, 民族精神, or national character. These have to do with specific social conditions at specific moments in history. It's not that Italians would always arrange it that way. Another way to look at this actually is through trade porcelain. In this case, it's very interesting. In the 16th, 17th centuries, when Portuguese aristocrats ordered plates from China, porcelain plates, porcelain was one of the most precious materials on earth at the time. They would send a picture of their family crest. And then the Chinese, and they wanted decoration. Then the Chinese artist has a problem. What do I do? Because the crest represents a society which is aristocratic, where China had been post-aristocratic since the mid-10th century. And so the Chinese designs, as you can see, are typical sort of middle class things, flowers, birds, stories from opera scenes and so on, which the Portuguese would not necessarily understand, but they would understand that these are beautiful ornaments that surround the coat of arms. But in any case, they're kept absolutely separate. And I think this is because there was no way to actually integrate the two. These are very different types of social systems. We see this here also where the crest is off on the side, and you have more of a landscape of China there. But so there are different ways to do it, but there are many, many of these plates, and the crest is almost always completely separate. I'll get back to this later when we look at gardens. Now, the kind of analysis I'm doing is inspired by Lakoff and Johnson. They wrote this back in the 80s, but its influence continues. And they argue that our conceptual system is largely metaphorical. And the way we think, what we experience, and what we do every day is very much a matter of metaphor. And one of the important metaphors for art history is orientational metaphors. In general, the major orientations, up, down, in, out, central, peripheral, active, passive, seem to cut across all cultures. But which ways they're oriented vary, and that is certainly true. And yet, it's amazing how often they are identical. So you can see on the left, the most important figure, Dong Wanggong, is in the center and on the top, and he has subordinate figures to left and right. And Jesus has basically the donors to left and right, and then there's the health or the resurrection of the dead below him. And again, you have subordinate deities in the Chinese mirror. So these things would not be difficult to decode even across cultures. Of course, one of the most important orientations in both China and Europe is the top-down one. They mentioned that these orientations arise from the fact that we have bodies the way we do. Our heads are on the top, and that gives, when we stand up, we have more control and so on. And of course, it isn't only people who recognize the meaning of these representations. So there's no need to appeal to influence or any kind of contact to explain the convergence of visual strategies in these two objects. The spatial configuration and our own bodies is apparent to all members of our species, not to mention wolves, and so is available as a semiotic frame for designating levels of social agency. But of course, these things can be complicated, as we'll see. But arguably, the top-down spatial metaphor has informed aristocratic models of intergroup relations across Eurasia from ancient times to the present. It informs the Narmer palette with the pharaoh about to bludgeon a helpless captive beneath him. It also informs the image of Emperor Hadrian crushing an enemy child beneath his feet. On the right here, you see a Tianwang, a Chinese Buddhist guardian figure who is crushing a non-Buddhist, presumably a non-Buddhist demon figure. And you'll notice the pain, which is evident on the figure's face. This is an important feature of this, both East and West. It's not just that the domination is easy. It's not just that the dominated figure is completely helpless. It's also that the dominated figure is in pain. On the left, you can see this child seems to be attempting to get up and, of course, cannot. Another thing is the facial features. You'll notice the smug look on Hadrian's face and on the guardian figure also, as if, this was easy. It is therefore no accident that from the 16th through the 18th centuries, when aristocracy was the dominant social system across most of Europe, we find countless images of domination drawn largely from classical mythology. Maybe because I did start out in European art, but I majored in Chinese art, so maybe that's why I noticed. I've been in lots of museum storerooms across America and in Europe and elsewhere, and there are hundreds and hundreds of these figures, and my colleagues in the field confirmed that that is indeed the case. They would adorn tables, furniture. You see them in gardens and everything. To the left, that's Apollo is having this satyr flayed alive because he insulted Apollo. This is an excellent case on the right here from the Victoria and Albert Museum, where we see Samson considering whether he's going to bludgeon this Philistine. The Philistine is completely helpless at his mercy, and it looks as if Samson has paused to think, shall I kill him or not? And that, I think, is the point of this. The point seems to have been to demonstrate that the dominated figure was entirely subject to the whim of the dominant figure. And this, as it happens, accurately instantiates the early modern conception of aristocratic honor, at least as understood by Montesquieu in Spirit of the Laws. He mentions that in aristocracies, honor is the very spring of authority, which is why aristocracies don't need checks and balances, by the way. And he says, to this whimsical honor is owing that the virtues are only just when it pleases and as it pleases. It adds rules of its own invention to everything prescribed to us aristocrats. It extends or limits our duties according to its own fancy, that is, according to honor's own fancy, which basically means honor is naturally subject to whims, by which the subject's obedience will be always directed. In other words, the aristocrat can do whatever he wants to, so of course you're going to be obedient. So changing intergroup relations between the 10th and 11th centuries in China, let me just start by pointing out that this kind of relationship, this feudal relationship between aristocrats who essentially have largely arbitrary authority and their subjects, also obtains in China pretty much from the 3rd through the 9th and mid-10th centuries. So I'm going to start with the 10th century when things begin to change. So during the 10th century, pictures of ordinary people doing ordinary things replaced pictures of aristocrats and their surrogate deities. Monks still appear in paintings, but usually in very ordinary guise rather than as servants of a god. We even find people, sort of half-dressed, sleeping on a hot summer's day. Ordinary in the upper left, you see ordinary workers at an eatery, just chowing down. Lower left, a middle-class woman and her family are out buying flowers and so on. And on the right, a monk drunk out of his mind, about to write some calligraphy. So the picture on the right below is a medieval picture. It's a Tang, and on the upper left is a Song, 12th century probably. When aristocratic norms, institutions, and values begin to break down, a culture of informality arises, I would argue, necessarily, because when social roles are assigned according to performance or merit, then social mobility arises, making group membership less important. Aristocracies are structured on group membership. The borders between groups, such as Buddhist and Taoist or Chinese and Khitan, become much more porous, which is why we don't have religious wars in China after the Song. It's hard to imagine a bodhisattva like the one on the left. Many of you have seen this if you've ever visited Hangzhou. In during medieval China period, they look more like the piece on the right, this beautiful Northern Qi statue of a Buddha, a very dignified, very calm, and so on, very different from the Ling Yin Bodhisattva. Artists and poets now might focus on private moments in the lives of middle class or even working people in the understanding that ordinary people and ordinary things have dignity. This was a point that was made over and over and over by the Guwen poets starting in the 9th century, people like Bai Zhiyi, Liu Zongyan, later on Su Dongpo, Huang Tingjian, and so on. So Miao Chen was once asked, what do you need to make a great poem? He said, make the classical new, make the ordinary art. We find actually a whole body of a new subject in painting and in poetry, portraying friendships between scholars and villagers, as you see here. And of course, the greatest poet and arguably the greatest political figure of the 11th century, Su Dongpo, is portrayed here in a work made in his own time in a very casual manner with his shirt open. He's got a bit of a pot belly. He's holding a jug of wine, a raw fish, and so on. So, yeah, these and artists deal with these things. And of course, there are institutional correlates. And as I said, I can't go into that in the detail that I love to do. But I will quote a bit from a book by Qu Chaoli from Chuanda. And he mentions, of course, that in sometimes blind examinations, that is to say they were anonymous, identified qualified individuals irrespective of social status or religious, ethnic, or class background. That's because the graders didn't know these things. The names were covered with numbers, and then the whole thing was copied by a scribe so that you couldn't even tell from the calligraphy what a person's class background might be. Differences over policy normatively were not decided on the basis of a class, for example, but facts were gathered and analyzed by expert ad hoc committees. Quite a few sinologists have written on this topic. Again, Qu Chaoli, should a taxpayer feel a judgment was unfair or that her rights, and it was her rights because the women paid taxes, therefore they could take suits to court on their own authority. If she felt her rights had been infringed, she could use the grievance offices to complain and get the matter investigated. She could also appeal the case to a higher level court, such as a circuit inspector. And here, this is from another book, 中国民法史, if the parties involved in a civil lawsuit are dissatisfied with the judgment made by the state government, they can appeal to a supervisory official. To prevent the drawback of favoritism, corruption, and emotional bias during the appeals process, the Song legal code stipulated that the supervisory official handling civil and criminal cases must not assign the case to the original judicial institution. In fact, typically, they would assign the case to a different county. This is not always the case in modern Western countries today. Sometimes, and maybe even often, if there's a dispute over whether a policeman overstepped his authority, it's investigated by his department very often. As the status of servants improved, the government did not prohibit servants from marrying officials. That's very important. What it basically means is there was cross-class marriage, not just between servants and officials, but all over the place. They did not allow servants to live with their masters and form marriages together, and that's so that the servants wouldn't be exploited. As for divorce, a notable feature is that it has expanded the initiative. Women basically could divorce in some times. And finally, Yu Yingguo has written a good book on the complex checks and balances built in to the post-aristocratic system in China. But four important points he makes is first, that system distinguished between the officer and the authority of the office. I can't overemphasize how important that is because it's sometimes confused even today. The authority is in the office, it's not in the officer. So if the officer violates the charge or the duties of the office, he's automatically subject to prosecution. At least that's the way it was done in Imperial China. There were systemic checks throughout the system, which Europeans noticed in the 17th century, which worked down up as well as up, down, and across. Appointments to any office required specific qualifications suited to the office. In other words, it was meritocratic. And if you weren't suited to the office, if you didn't have the 资格, then you could be dismissed. There were departments and bureaus authorized to independently criticize official policies, so that even after the 上书, or later the 内阁, passed, that's the cabinet, after the cabinet passed a law, it had to go through two different departments for review, and they could send it back if they thought it violated or if it might be prejudicial to the people. So that the reason I went through all that is because Europeans encounter all this in the 17th and 18th centuries. And many of them are saying, oh, gee, these are pretty good ideas. Maybe we should think about that. So what can pictures tell us about interstate or intercultural relations as normatively imagined? Well, gardens offer a prime medium for the negotiation of intergroup relations because they typically align with one or other cosmological model. And there are two essays on that in the collection of essays that Shuchen Xiang and I just published. I quote Anthony Close on the idea of nature in medieval and parts of, even into early modern Europe. Plato affirms that the first creative power is divine soul. Of course, Aristotle says the same thing, says soul is important over body, soul rules over body. In fact, the cosmos is the work of divine art, and nature, if it can be called a creative power at all, is a subordinate instrument of the divine principle of soul. What this boils down to is that nature and natural before into the mid 18th century really referred more to God and to God's. Notice that God is holding a compass, God's geometric and rational order. This is familiar to many of you, I'm sure. So originally, God and nature were basically the same thing. Here we see a mural painting from the 14th century, and you see God is outside the system, which is why he can control it. And the system is built up of a hierarchy with the angels closest to God, and then different hierarchies of angels, and then, down to aristocracy and so on. The historian Stephen Toulmin explained how 17th century thinkers assumed that matter can only be set in motion by a higher agency, meaning God. They saw in nature, as in society, that the actions of lower things, like commoners, depended on and were subordinate to oversight and command by higher creatures, the nobility, and ultimately by the creator. So it's no accident that in 18th century England, almost all magistrates were members of the nobility. My colleague Hans Saucy wrote on gardens, and he starts out with this observation. The 17th century garden or painting is designed to be seen from a single point of view, and no other point will give quite the same result, the correct result. Designing a point of view into a landscape supposes and confirms an absolute manner of seeing things. Saucy's analysis implies that these gardens illustrate a particular conception of intergroup relations, lord versus commoners, in a world of zero-sum logic. So in other words, these geometric gardens are basically a lateral expression of what we see on the right. It's still zero-sum logic. The historian Liu Yu, who's in our collected essays, has traced this transformation of European thought from a dualistic religious worldview to a monistic secular one. And others have written about this, Jonathan Israel, of course, at the Institute for Advanced Study. And he basically says that it goes in the English landscape garden goes from regularity to irregularity, and ultimately repudiates an externally imposed geometry or symmetry and embraces a new aesthetic ideal inspired by asymmetrical layouts, which permit much more fluid interactions between people within the garden. And again, you can get some of this from that book. So what were the normative intergroup relations in 17th century Europe? Hamish Scott, who's devoted his life to the study of the European aristocracy, notes that by the middle of the 18th century, as much as half of all English land had been placed within hereditary settlements called entailments, right? And 100 years later, the figure was probably 70 to 90%. This basically means that it's almost impossible to get the aristocracy out of power because they own most of the land, which means most of the money. In some times, on the contrary, most of the land was in private hands. Harrison White notes that the modern civil service recruitment system was shaped by a major change to merit, a merit system in the 1880s. This is very late, right? And that marks a change to from a more personalistic mode to a more modern professional bureaucracy. But in fact, the process started much earlier. And my Rutledge book traces this. Other people have done this too. Certainly, I'm not the only one. So why were early modern Europeans so interested in China's bureaucratic system? This is Jonathan Israel quoting Isaac Vossius. They noticed that China had the biggest cities and had trade all over the world, including from Latin America to Japan. Everybody was buying porcelain, tea, silk. And Vossius and many others started saying, well, maybe it's because they had this merit-based system, which he compared to Plato's Republic. That was the closest thing they had at the time. And Robert Batchelor writes also that during that period, 17th, 18th century, Dutch and Jesuit literature stressed that China was a populous, urbanized commercial society with strong institutions devoted to the replication of merit. Neuhoff was one of the first to describe around 1666, how this worked, and the Europeans realized that the Chinese literati not only they're not nobility, and yet they can hold authority, they can become officials, and moreover, they can discuss and criticize public matters, even when they're not officials. So there was nothing quite like that in Europe. So he used the word philosopher or philosophe. And these were the terms that they used for the Chinese literati, that is, people who could be chosen irrespective of religion, race, or class. So he tells us that when the Chinese philosophers they're only concerned with learning, and as they grow more and more excellent in learning, they mount by steps to the highest degree of honor. That was his word for office. Honor actually is a social status. It's not an office at all. And likewise, dignity signifies a social status. This is because there was no clear distinction at that time in Europe between an office, the office and the officer. Office was understood as a function of the officer's social class and level. So how did merit come to be associated with Chinese gardens, garden rocks? Well, in China, this happens already. In the late Tang, Bai Ji basically invents the Chinese garden rock, stresses that it's absolutely unique. There are no two rocks alike. And the rock he chose is just like him. His character, his personality is just like this rock. And this goes viral very quickly. And before you know it, you get pictures of scholars with their rocks, and the rocks are all completely different. Then this idea continues into the Song. The poet Tao Yuanming is associated with his rock. That doesn't happen in the poem, by the way. The poem is 5th century. There were no garden rocks then, but the Sung painter in the 11th century said, no, no, we have to show that he's completely individual. We associate him with a rock. And Neuhoff noticed this. And he writes, he says, these artificial mountains or cliffs the Chinese make, and he provides an illustration, exaggerated, but the shape of it is correct, are commonly contrived with chambers and antechambers for defense against heat, and the learned seek to study in them rather than any other place. So from this point on, the Chinese literati are associated with these garden rocks. And this works its way out throughout the 18th century. It's a fascinating phenomenon. So by the 18th century, both Chinese and progressive European intellectuals both had the understanding that a merit-based system offered an alternative to aristocratic rule, and that there was a habit of associating merit-based philosophers with garden rocks. During the 1730s, according to Robert Batchelor, the British patriots, he's talking about the Whigs, began to combine ideas about the beauty and merit of beauty and merit by appealing to a Chinese notion of aesthetics as embodied in the garden. And one of the earliest of these is Sir Richard Temple's garden at Stowe. The Chinese philosopher's pavilion you see here is more recent in date, but there was one at the time. Some of the Whigs associated with a group called the Free Thinkers, going back to the 20s, and that is the 1720s. And in their journals, they often cited Chinese texts in support of merit-based appointment, holding an officer to his charge, because they understood that the authority was in the office, not in the officer, the promotion of learning generally, and the charge of government is to further the welfare of the nation, meaning the general population. So aristocracy and meritocracy, you must understand, are conceptual opposites. So how did European garden designers merge or manage the intergroup relations between these two models, these two social models? Well, again, as I mentioned earlier, the word nature, the idea natural in in the 17th and early 18th century referred to God's geometric order. So Louis Lecomte describes the Chinese canals as natural because they're absolutely straight and equal and orderly. So yes, they're natural. It's just the opposite of what we would think. Christopher Wren, writing in 1700, again, natural is from geometry, consisting in uniformity. Always the true test is natural or geometrical beauty. That's a law of nature. And this is related to one-point perspective, as Nicholas Mirtzoff points out. Apart from their scientific interests, perspective images sought to make the world comprehensible to the powerful figure who stood at the single point from which it was drawn. Hans Saucy has already pointed this out. In this particular scene, Raphael, Jesus, and Saint Peter are right there in line with the end point. So how are China-Europe intergroup relations visualized in early 18th century gardens? Well, at Stowe, you sometimes get classical references by themselves, and sometimes they're juxtaposed with Chinese things. So on the left, you have a Chinese philosopher's pavilion, and on the right, you have a Palladian bridge. They did not see these as contradictory. They did not see the Chinese things as alien. One reason is that already by 1691, as President Trump pointed out yesterday, I think, there was a book called The Morals of Confucius, which had been published, and it summarized Confucian thought, borrowing from the Great Learning and Mencius, as well as from the Analects. And the fact that there was such a book that was called Morals put Confucius, or actually Chinese thought, on a par with European thought, because in those days there was the morals of Aristotle, the morals of Plato, the morals of Cicero, the morals of St. Thomas, and so on. So all the great philosophers had the Morals book, and so Confucius was put on a par. They really didn't see these as incompatible. You'll notice this garden is not geometric. It's not irregular either, but at least it's able to accommodate these two systems precisely because it's not geometric. By mid-century, you'll get sort of mixed gardens like what we have at Chiswick, where part of it is formal and they begin to start to use these wavy pathways. If you look carefully, they're still geometric. These are sine curves, okay? Those wavy lines can be mathematically described, but nonetheless, they look more irregular. So there's an attempt to introduce irregularity into the formal garden. But still, it was difficult because they're really totally different systems. One system is dualistic, philosophically speaking, and the other is monistic. When you get to Shugborough, 1747, I'm showing you on the right a detail from a painting of the Shugborough Garden. You see a Chinese philosopher's pavilion, which actually does capture some of the features of Chinese design, the asymmetry, the fact that the pavilion is nestled into a bunch of trees. There's a bridge nearby, and there's a curved waterway beside it. This is the garden of Lord Anson. This is on the left. You see the main mansion as it looks today. That's a portrait of Lord Anson. He was stationed in the East India Company in Canton for a number of years, and so he knew about Chinese gardens. And he came back with some memos. As you go into the Grand Hall, on the ceiling, you'll see Apollo, of course, who stands for enlightenment, as well as for the aristocracy many times, as we saw earlier. On the walls are medallions of Greek philosophers on three walls. On one wall is Confucius. So there again, Confucius is, or Chinese thought is put on a par with the European thought, and this is not considered to be alien. Some of the rooms were decorated entirely in what Hansen thought was, or at least with Chinese objects. Some of which give a view of the garden, which again, we see a little studio nestled up against a garden rock and some trees. And then other parts are in European design. And you could also get ideas at that time from wallpaper made in China and then shipped to Europe, like this one you've seen in Blicking Hall in Norfolk, 1760s. Again, you see this kind of pavilion against the water, garden rocks, trees next to the pavilion, and so on. You even find it on coffee cups. And if you were to use a coffee cup like this in Tom's coffee shop in London, people presumably would understand that you look favorably upon a meritocratic system. So what about the conceptual side? How is merit-based logic inserted? Actually, I'm going to skip this part. I can show you later. I just find it really interesting that in England at this time, you get much more liberal views in a publication like Spectator, where Joseph Addison and Richard Steele argue against the superstitious use of Christianity, and argue for facts and reason. And in China also, in sometimes Ouyang Xiu and Su Nunpo both make strong arguments against the superstitious use. They're not arguing against religion. Religion is fine. Just don't go around blaming people, calling people sinners because they were victims of a disaster, something like that. So these ideas are already being shared by, you might say, the left wing in England and China. Personal worth based on merit is by nature egalitarian because your group membership doesn't count. All people possess a capacity for rational thought. This is in the Morals of Confucius, by the way, and can improve themselves. Reason tells me there's no ontological difference between me and someone else. We're all human. Therefore, we all make mistakes, and therefore we can give each other slack. Yeah, so Joseph Addison makes the argument, so does Ouyang Xiu. So both in China and Europe, the adoption of facts and reason to adjudicate moral and political issues was being, in England, this was mainly on the left. In China, this was standard. The use of facts and reason presumes equality because it ignores groups in favor of individual performance. Equality requires compassion for the views of others and a tolerance for the views of others, hence a garden which has multiple views. Now let's see how that gets negotiated in the garden. I'm almost done now. There are basically four techniques that were used in England that I can see for managing intergroup relations in gardens. First, as we've seen, separate but adjacent placement. Secondly, the use of metonymy to place different cultural elements within an English garden. So you might have a Chinese pavilion to stand for Chinese merit, and you might have a medieval castle to stand for some Gothic values. Juxtaposition of different cultural elements within the garden, and then full integration of China and European elements. We've already seen this kind of approach. Here again, we see the sine curve. It's basically geometry without straight lines. But nonetheless, it's interesting because it's separated from the straight line geometry part of the garden. And we actually see a Chinese pavilion in the middle. Le Rouge identifies this as a jardin anglo-chinois. So there's a Chinese pavilion there, and you're supposed to understand that that's why we have the wiggly pathways. This, I think, is a little bit like what we saw with the plates. You have the formal part of the garden, which takes up most of the space, and then there's a little area in the upper left, which is given to a more irregular disposition of water and pathways. A view from the ground, thanks to Le Rouge. Again, you might have a section of the garden with a castle, sort of a medieval castle. Notice the curving pathway, right? And you might have a Chinese philosopher's pavilion next to a curving waterway. This is an interesting experiment. I don't think this lasted long, but you still have trees in rows, lined in rows along the pathway, but they're different heights and they're allowed to grow freely. On the other hand, on the left, you have the formal part of the garden. And as you go down the steps to the informal part of the garden, you go into this wilder area with irregular slopes and a Chinese pavilion toward the center there, if you can see that. So that stands by metonymy for a different set of values, which are now being incorporated into this French garden. Here again, you have an interesting experiment. Again, in the upper left of the plan, you have the Chinese section of the garden. Again, this is identified as Jardin Anglo-Chinois. And it does look, the design is not unlike a Chinese garden, except that it's much bigger and more in the European taste. But then there's a section in the middle where you have geometry inserted into the irregular part of the garden. So it's interesting that these are seen as elements that can be intersected, where they can intersect with one another. It's just about this time in mid-century that William Chambers writes his book about Chinese gardens, which has been much criticized by people who don't read Chinese, as he made it all up. That's actually not the case. If we compare his descriptions of Chinese gardening principles with Ji Cheng's essay from the 16th century, which he did not see, but Ji Cheng's thinking was standard. If he talked to anyone, as he said he did, he would have learned about these principles. You see, the first thing you do is you take advantage of the native land of the ground. You go according to the contours, but then you make improvements like lopping off branches or hiding defects and things like that. These two are almost identical. Another example, but there are many more winding passages. Waters burst out from windings in the rocks. Long winding paths should lead into the garden, et cetera, et cetera. So actually, much of what he says, certainly not all of it, corresponds rather closely to Chinese garden theory. So this had enormous impact in France and England, and people start to adopt his suggestions, including willow trees, Chinese bridges, and so on. So by the late 18th century, you see this plan of Trianon. You have two Chinese pavilions and the formal garden. And then you have a garden which is truly irregular, which truly admits of many different views, which are necessarily individual. That is, the views are not being imposed on the people who move around in those gardens. They can form their own positions. They can become completely individual as was the ideology behind the Chinese garden rock. And indeed, we begin to see many more Chinese garden rocks, Chinese bridges. You see willows here. Um, and I'm not talking about influence. My interest here is integration of that, or basically how these disparate views are negotiated. And what actually happens, and this is what Liu Yu's essay is about, is that Europeans make their own. They basically move from a mechanical kind of ontological view with God on the outside commanding everything to an organicist view where nature runs itself. And that takes on its own form in Europe, both intellectually and in the gardens. Camontel was a designer. He designed Montville. And actually, already by 1750, Horace Walpole, who later writes a book dismissing Chinese gardens, in 1750 he was very impressed by them, and he said, "Oh, the Chinese gardens are, so full of liberty. We need to learn from them." And here again, Camontel, this then becomes almost a cliche. By the 1770s, 80s, the idea that an irregular garden basically instantiates the idea of liberty is very, very widespread. Wathelet in France, um, yeah, many people are doing it. Camontel, here we see an image of a viewing tower, which is described in Sima Guang's essay on gardens, which was translated into French at this time. And Sima Guang had a viewing tower, and you see one here in Rancy, and you also see the Garden Rocks. So the Garden Rock is still associated with these literati, with intellectuals. And at Paynes Hill, Charles Hamilton, at great expense, had a rock brought in, which he thought looked very much apparently like a Chinese garden rock. Um, Gilpin did drawings of it, and Oswald Seren argues that this was no accident. He chose this deliberately to reference Chinese rocks. So we're getting off on time. I just gave more examples from Alexandre de Laborde, who shows us the transition from the formal garden to the natural garden and how it happened in several places. I think I can end there. The best example for me of a garden which is totally integrated, where it's very difficult to say this is Chinese and this is European, because European views of nature by that time had become organicist, and so this is no longer foreign. I think Merville is a very good example of that. There are very many other examples as well. And so we've seen that these kinds of relationships between groups can be expressed in many ways. And we've seen how this can be done in the garden. Thank you very much for listening.
Terrific. Thank you so much. Marty, well, first of all, thank you very much. That was really fascinating and very rich in ideas and stimulating and boy, a great blast of ideas. So I'm hopeful that there will be some nice questions and thoughts from the group that is attending. While you have this particular image on the screen and before we release the share, want to explain, I think we get it, but want to say something about your choice of that Hero Elementary new series cover that we see.
Yes, actually, I've tried this out on students and they usually get it. Yes. So it's ironic because I wanted to point out that using this kind of visual analysis, you can also expose equivocation. So in this case, I believe the intent of the ad was to say, here we have a cartoon which is wholesome and good for kids. It teaches them to be tolerant and et cetera, et cetera. But in fact, there's a very strict hierarchy built into the image. The kid in the middle is not only a white kid, he's not only blonde, he's bigger than everybody else. And you might think that they're all on the same plane. This is not actually true. There's a curve. You see the curve? And if you look at the building behind, the building is also curved with the center of the building moving forward. And so everything moves forward from the center, which is where the white kid is. So the Hispanic girl is closest to him. I won't explain why, you can imagine. And but she's also a bit back. And then the black kid is further and also further back. So the distance from the white kid increases. And then the Chinese girl is way back and also the smallest in the group. So you have a very clear hierarchy. And you'll notice that, like the image on the left, there are three spires. You see, Thomas has a spire to the right, to the left, and on top,
Mm.
and there's a gable above him. And this is true here also. The hero thing covers the central gable, but we can assume there's a gable in the middle because there are gables on the two sides. So it's, yeah, these, you can use these techniques to uncover equivocal
Yeah.
images can be equivocal. Yes.
I love it. All right. Well, thank you. Want to release the share and then we
Okay.
will invite people to, you'll be able to see people and people will be able to ask questions. So everybody, now's your chance to, let me see if anybody's done anything by chats. And also I'm going to stop recording now.
Okay. Hmm.
I'm going to
Excellent
try,
idea.
try to stop recording now.